Great. Thanks, Jamie. All right, so I will give a bit of context about what Platypus even is, what this organisation is, whose posters you've seen all around the University of Auckland campus, and what we are trying to do as an organisation. And my presentation will be perhaps cryptic, but hopefully in a provocative way, and we can talk it through afterwards via Q&A. Can I just check everyone can hear me all right? Yeah, cool. All right. So I will begin. The critical theorist Theodor Adorno said in 1933 that the theorist who intervenes in practical controversies nowadays discovers on a regular basis, and to his shame, that whatever ideas he might contribute were expressed long ago, and usually better the first time round. I find it disconcerting that if Adorno's claim is absolutely correct and holds true as a general principle, Adorno can only have said it better than I can today. That is, everything I'm about to tell you has been said before, including the very claim that it has been said before. Adorno was a Marxist, a member of the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, a group of German intellectuals closer to Marx than we are to the moon landing. For Adorno's generation, revolution was not a slogan, but a fact. He had friends and colleagues who, calling themselves Marxists, participated in the European revolutions that took place at the end of World War I. By comparison, the question of Marxism today might appear daunting and opaque for young people who, having not been born in the 20th century, can't help but feel no connection to the 19th, that century of Marx and Marxism. Platypus was formed in 2006, during the height of the Iraq War, by a group of students at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago who formed a reading group around the problems and tasks of emancipatory politics and its history, rediscovering key texts from the tradition of Marxism. They wanted to understand why Marxism seemed to disappear in the late 20th century, only to rise again years later. What these millennials noticed was that the latest decline of Marxism had coincided with the fall of the Soviet Union, only to be picked up again in the next decade by progressives who wanted a theoretical way of responding to the Iraq War, and then the global financial collapse that became the backdrop to the Occupy Wall Street protests. Even so, these early Platypus members could not help but notice that Marxism was continually recovered only in a selective and piecemeal way. And so Platypus began its 20-year journey as an educational, not activist or political, project, hoping to uncover the hidden potentialities of activism and politics. This teaching exists to address three things. First, the peculiarity of our project, which doesn't declare itself at the outset with an obvious name like the Socialist Worker International or Progressive Revolutionary Organization or United Liberation Front, but just simply Platypus. Secondly, it will address the peculiarity of the left in general. And third, the peculiarity of history, how it might appear that the new is merely the old in distress. The necessary and insufficient character of our project lies in these three peculiarities, and as such, we might come off a little counterintuitive at first, so I will walk you through it. Part 1, the peculiarity of Platypus. Take, for instance, the trifold, which all of you have in front of you. I'll hand one to who just arrived. Here you go, pass it back. Included in it is our statement of purpose, written in 2007, a document that explains how Platypus exists, not to further the aims of activism today, nor to counter them, but to reconstitute a future emancipatory movement, a sentiment that resonates with our founding slogan, "The left is dead, long live the left." This might seem counterintuitive, contradictory even, to those who insist that a future left can only be formed on the basis of the present left, that the left has been weakened but not destroyed. And yet we claim that the left is dead. Insofar as Platypus seems counterintuitive, it might attract claims of defeatism or pessimism, that by declaring the left to be dead, Platypus is pecking at it, trying to kill the left. But Platypus does not want the left to be dead. It derives no satisfaction from the left's present condition. It does not desire the death of the left, because that would imply there is a left left to die. Instead, we say the left is dead, because we believe the left exists only in the past tense as a matter of history. The left's death has to be declared to make it apparent what it would mean to revive it. Conversely, Platypus contends that it would be equally absurd to reject charges of defeatism in favour of triumphalism, which implies that the left is ascendant or would be ascendant if not for stubborn obstacles in its way, like Donald Trump or fascism or neoliberalism or imperialism or what have you. In this way, triumphalism is merely the inverse of defeatism. Triumphalism casts the demons out, turning inner failure into external conditions to be surmounted, whereas defeatism places the blame within. Platypus is neither triumphalist nor defeatist. Platypus says the left is dead, long live the left, because it regards triumphalism and defeatism as two sides of the same coin. Both presume the existence of the left, no matter how marginal its existence, how abstract its basis. At the same time, we in Platypus admit that the peculiarity of our project invites suspicion from the triumphalists and a false feeling of affinity from the defeatists. Both are forms of misrecognition. We desire neither. And this is what makes us peculiar. Although we come out and state our view clearly, that the left is dead, you have to come a little closer and ask us what we mean. Those who refuse to do so take up a reactive position, judging us via first impressions, hearsay, and whatever preconceptions they have inherited about the left through osmosis. When we in Platypus are called Trotskyists, most who identify with Trotskyism actually disagree. When people call us quote-unquote Leninists, most who call themselves Leninists disagree. When we are called eclectic academic Marxists, most of those who are eclectic academic Marxists disagree. Platypus functions as a mirror to the left. Whatever claims about Platypus we encounter from those who call themselves the left, be these claims suspicious or defensive, they say more about those who call themselves the left than they do about Platypus. But if the left really is dead, what are all these people who today identify as being quote-unquote on the left? Few of them actually agree with Platypus that there is such a thing as the left. Indeed, from their standpoint today, there is only a plurality of lefts. But in this claim, they are united. So united are they in their division that they evoke the ancient Greek mythological beast, the Hydra, with its many heads, each snapping against the others. Each head thinks itself independent, thinks it alone is the leftmost. Whenever one head is cut off, another two sprout in its place. But what if, insofar as this left beast is everything, it is nothing? What if the left of yesterday, that of revolutionary Marxism at its pre-World War I height, the largest mass movement in history, long ago decomposed? We might regard the image of the platypus on the screen behind me in a similar way. I already said that Platypus is neither a triumphalist nor defeatist project, because there is no left to succeed or to be defeated. Platypus might be regarded not as one of God's living, beautiful creatures, but a dissected carcass. If the left is dead, and Platypus represents the memory of the left, then Platypus too is dead. Yet this remains a hard case to prosecute. Leftism today is caught up in restless and neurotic acts of compulsion, continually breaking things down in order to build them up again, reshaping them in its own image, satisfying its own aversion to ambiguity, inventing elaborate taxonomies, not on the basis of understanding reality, but justifying one's own preconceptions inherited from progressive common sense. Knowledge, when existing purely for its own sake, becomes deadly. Stalinists busy themselves with catching out Platypus as trots in order to excuse themselves from having to think about the great historical problem posed by Stalinism and Trotskyism in the 20th century. Social democrats and left unity projects today call Platypus ideologically fixated in order to avoid contemplating sectarianism. Hardcore activists write off Platypus as theory nerds or a Marxist book club, precisely to avoid confronting how much their aversion to theory is itself a kind of theory, or more specifically, a false distinction that is the product of the crisis of theory and practice in general. We, on the other hand, simply call ourselves Platypus, inherited via an anecdote about Marx's longtime collaborator, Friedrich Engels, who, when hearing about a platypus at the British Zoo, was incredulous at first. It defied 19th century conceptions of evolutionary history. Was this creature a mammal, an amphibian, a marsupial, neither fish nor fowl? We explain this in our founding documents, after which this teach-in is titled. Quote, like Marx, a good materialist and a thinker receptive to Darwin's theory of evolution, which dethroned a human-centered view of nature, Engels came to respect that reason in history, natural or otherwise, must not necessarily accord with present standards of human reason. We take this as our metaphor for the left, so long as there is the possibility that a future left will look nothing like what we currently understand the left to be. The Polish Marxist Leszek Kołakowski wrote that whereas the right, quote, strives to idealize actual conditions, not to change them, the left needs a conceptual self-understanding. Quote, the left gives forth utopias, just as the pancreas discharges insulin, by virtue of an innate law, end quote. By utopias, he meant not wistful idealistic fancies, but visions that aim to transform society. When these are abandoned, the left becomes nearsighted, surrendering itself to what Kołakowski calls tactics. Milton Friedman, of all people, said that in times of crisis, people reach for the ideas that are nearest at hand. And so Platypus might at first seem only to be useful in a piecemeal way, incorporated or dispensed as the situation requires. That should say dispensed with as the situation requires. When today's avowed left is in a moment of upswing, it turns away from Platypus. When it is demoralized, it turns to Platypus for advice. The task for Platypus is to remember that we are not the left is dead. And it does not exist save for as a present absence, as word on a page that can easily be turned to, but found to be utterly incomprehensible. And in this way, we might also say that Platypus is the left. Part 2, the peculiarity of the left. Leon Trotsky wrote that after the 1905 Russian Revolution, not to be confused with the later Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, that despite the socialist movement's obstacles, the 19th century had not passed in vain. From the standpoint of today, however, we might ask whether the 20th century has passed in vain, potentially nullifying Trotsky's declaration, and with it, all of revolutionary history. Indeed, few remember much about what Marxism was, other than through the lens of the 20th century. We have ready at hand only the slogans, quotations, book titles and references in films and artworks that date from our parents' time, that of Generation X and the Boomers, and their parents. Today, people read less on average than ever before and receive history not via hard-won lessons but at a remove. Students in high schools are taught not the meaning or context of Marxism as it was, that is, the self-clarification of the working class movement for socialism, the subjective reflection of the industrial revolutions, society's attempts to clarify its own meaning, but the aftermath of Marxism as a global ideology competing with capitalism. Such a compressed history is made out of bullet points: the Soviet Union, Stalin, the Red Scare and McCarthyism, the Chinese Revolution, the Cultural Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Bay of Pigs, the Cold War, the space race, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the fall of the Soviet Union. On those rare occasions when teachers teach Marxism to their students in order to affirm it, they treat Marxism as only as useful as an exception, a treatment which ultimately proves that capitalism is the rule. Some might object, arguing that third world revolutionaries still exist and fight today. Others will inevitably bark back, calling the former view a quote-unquote Stalinist understanding of quote-unquote socialism in one country, instead contending that Marxism can only be realized internationally. Others, growing tired of hearing the same old arguments repeated ad infinitum, will do as previous generations have done, retreating either into exclusive but marginal sectarian groups or the ivory tower, or abandoning politics altogether. True, like any religion, every position has been taken up in the name of Marxism. No matter what case you're trying to prosecute, there will be a Marx and Engels quote waiting for you as evidence. You will find historical examples too, and you will win the argument so long as your opponent cannot find the time to read and has not the energy to prove you wrong. Such is the fatigue in politics today. But the left will continue to be dead so long as these discussions bear no productive outcome. Platypus, however, are not defeatists. This is why we are interested in hosting such discussions, however frustrating they can be, via our public activity. As far as we are concerned, these conversations are not a matter of dredging up the historical data that proves one's argument about the present, but rather finding how and why that history seems not to inform us about the present. We insist that history must not be mistaken for a series of developments and course corrections, but as an accumulation of missed opportunities. For this reason, our reading group syllabus and our pedagogy are not to offer a superior or more intelligent Marxism, but rather to remain humbled by these missed opportunities and to make good on them, presenting what Marxism was historically and registering its obstacles today. Omer Hussein has written, quote, "The left is dead" is not simply a moral condemnation of the existing left for failing to meet abstract criteria of being healthy or alive. Rather, the left is dead according to its own history, in relation to what it once was, and what it imagined itself to be. Whereas Kołakowski said back in 1958 that the left gives forth utopias, quote, just as the pancreas discharges insulin, end quote, from the standpoint of today, there is not a utopia in sight. This allows me to address that other half of Platypus's founding slogan, long live the left. As Ethan Linehan has said, quote, Platypus exists as a self-educational project to clarify what goals the historical left set for itself so long ago, and all the ways that the contemporary left thwarts its attempts to realise them. Insofar as the left's goals were formed from its ideology, the obstacles today are ideological. We trace our necessity all the way to Marx's call for a ruthless critique of everything existing that is not afraid of its results. Platypus does not try to answer questions like what is to be done. We are historically required to point out that what has been done for the past 100 years or more has not worked to advance the cause of socialism. We are one step removed from the ability to clarify the confusions of those who wish to change the world, like Marx was in a position to do, because of our historical discontinuity with the object of Marx's critique. Our time is not that of Marx or of Lenin. No such mass movement, conscious of itself, exists today. This is why we call our approach via negativa. We want to show the negative image of the critical consciousness of Marxism that is not present today. We want to show what might be right by showing what is wrong, end quote. Upon facing the accumulated desiderata that has accompanied the failure of the historical left, we can begin to make it useful, turning obstacles into opportunities, even if those opportunities are just part of clearing the road. When we host our panels and put leftists in conversation with one another via the Platypus Review and our podcast, we want young people to think critically about the historical stakes of these discussions. When we host coffee breaks, teach-ins, and reading groups, we want students to ask honest questions without concern for ideological dogmas and for taboos. Through this process of clarification of how the past is still acting on the present, we might be able to turn what Linehan described as, quote, a post-political or prematurely political moment into a genuinely political one. That is, one that is concerned with transforming society. Admitting this can be liberating. Instead of giving anxious reaction to the latest phase of capitalist world affairs, we can allow ourselves to exhale, going back to basics and reconsidering things soberly and patiently. Even so, we will be tested. Every time there is a sudden shift in capitalist politics, Platypus reinscribes its reason for being to make the death of the left palpable. And at every juncture, Platypus will experience kickback. We will find this frustrating. We will continually experience the Groundhog Day effect, hearing the same thing said by different people in different ways, or said by the same person in different ways. But this frustration is really frustration at the necessity and insufficiency of building an emancipatory movement for the future. So we encourage students to be humble, leaving their preconceptions at the door, reading texts from the high period of international revolutionary Marxism naively and in good faith. No mental shortcuts. Assuming the best of our authors, defending them even when we disagree with them. Maybe this simple task is yet too much to ask, when it requires forgetting the gulags, the hydrogen bomb, the sectarian manifestos and programs, the splits, the wreckers, the tyrants and traitors. Maybe it is too much to ask students to return to historical Marxism, because it requires going against the current, or what Walter Benjamin called reading history against the grain. In other words, we might only be able to understand Marxism at a remove today, since there are no longer any surviving participants of the Russian or German revolutions, and survivors of all the other 20th century revolutions are dying off. Even the student radicals of the 1960s are becoming an endangered species, and we have to record their dying confessions. In Marx's own words, quote, the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living, end quote. This statement, we argue, now applies to Marxism itself. Marxism only exists as a present absence haunting us from beyond the grave. What does this imply? The Stalinist historian Erich Hobsbawm remarked on how, at the end of the 19th century, it was commonplace to assume that the old order was crumbling and was to inevitably be replaced by some new system, socialist or otherwise. In the years leading up to World War I, millions of Marxists felt it was just obvious that revolution was around the corner. Liberals would read mainstream newspapers and absorb the views of Marxist critics. Visitors to the theatre would watch actors on the stage who, in their private lives, identified as Marxists. Wildly popular artworks and movements were created by Marxist artists and commissioned by Marxist intellectuals. In humanities courses at universities, Marx and Engels were offered to students as core readings and were taken seriously, even when their conclusions were not agreed with. Where people disagreed with the socialist slogan that, quote, another world is possible, end quote, they at least understood the reasoning. Today's intellectuals, on the other hand, reside not in the socialist parties of old, where they taught Marxism to other revolutionaries in night schools, bars, and coffee houses. No. Today's intellectuals have become a part of academia, NGOs, media, and taste circles. We might regard the professional discourse of intellectualism today as capitalism's attempt to understand itself even as it mystifies itself in the process. Marxism, by contrast, was an intellectual project in a much broader sense. It was the subjective expression of the era of capitalism, the self-consciousness of its potential for revolution, a way to understand what it was doing so that it could slam the emergency brake once and for all. Part 3, the peculiarity of history. I like to tell people that what attracted me to the left was punk music. When I was in my 20s, I worshipped the 1970s, the moment when the counterculture became radicalized and turned inwards. I looked up to those influenced by the Chinese Communist Party, like the Baader-Meinhof Group in Germany and the Weathermen in the US, even as I preached not the party, but mutual aid. I called myself an anarchist, even as I quoted Mao. I was what one might call a walking contradiction. Yet, like others of my generation, I was living through a crisis, and I merely reached for the ideas that were lying about, ready at hand. As I began reading, I found plenty of literature that agreed with me, but little that actually challenged me. The closer I thought I got to Marxism, the more I eventually realized I had been led away. And once I began reading seriously, I realized that my education in leftism defied the spirit of Marx and Marxism at its historical high watermark. At each false turn, I had no choice but to double back and try another path, not knowing where it would lead me. From the standpoint of where I am today, all of these experiences appear as part of a single piece of string, a red thread guiding me to where I am now, to Marxism, or more specifically, the realization that there is no such thing as a Marxist left anymore. My former experiences, that which radicalized me, were part of the red thread of my life, but only as dead ends, like the little pieces of fraying fibers you can only see when examining a thread under a microscope. I was provoked by Platypus, and now I want to reproduce my education in Platypus by provoking you, but only in the way that a teacher wants to encourage a promising student. In order for you to rethink Marxism, Platypus has to make you think. But in order to make you think, we first have to encourage you to doubt. Think about this. What does it mean to assume that everything you know about Marxism might be wrong? That everything that can be said has already been said before, but better. And yet, even so, the spirit of historical Marxism lingers so long as it remains plausible, that is, once it is understood. For all the frustrations that will accompany learning about the repeated failures of the left, you will uncover some potential lying in the obstacles of the present. But first, you might recognize what these obstacles are. To be a leftist today means commonly counter-identifying with the right. It often means adopting a contrary position to those you disagree with. Newly radicalized leftists react to the failure of the DSA and Bernie Sanders and Corbyn and Momentum, Syriza, Podemos, and all the other millennial left projects by aiming to become more militant and now forming autodidactic Communist Party or cadre organizations. Or they react by becoming organizers, aiming to improve upon the DSA by remaining true to the hard-won gains of the 2010s, but dispensing with the strategy. But whether today's leftists are militants or organizers, they are united in the way they are reproducing the problem. They merely adopt a reactive position by default, responding to global capitalist state politics, to America, to the Democrats, instead of envisioning a political horizon predicated on transforming the world. The historical left, by contrast, was self-motivated. It aimed to transform society, not merely reconstitute it with a different face, not a regime change. Even as it bore out repetitions, its radicals grappled with understanding the meaning of these repetitions, hoping to clarify what underlying aspects or contradictions of social reality are reproducing themselves in thought. This is what Marx meant by a ruthless critique of everything existing. He meant a philosophy of history. This is what we aim to bring out when we host the conversation on the left. We aim to take leftists seriously, sometimes even more seriously than they take themselves. We task them with recognizing ideological obstacles and, in the process, recovering not only their ancient past, but their short-term memory also. Through this process, they might be reminded what their inheritance is. Their inheritance being the ideological obstacles thrown up by the failure of the left and being passed down through miseducation. From this arises the talking points of the contemporary left. Theory becomes subordinated to practice. Capitalism, catalyzing crises of society in every domain, becomes no more than individual economic crises. And society per se becomes societies or nations. Even the most cheap talking points, the most degraded ideological ruins, entail theoretical concessions. Even so, these talking points demonstrate how ideological obstacles can be made productive. In Platypus, we admit the plausibility of these terms as catchments of ideology in distress, even as we refuse to concede to them. Admit everything, concede nothing. To take the left seriously means to ask the left, what do you mean by these terms? Why do you believe them? What happened that made them seem plausible? This is what gives Platypus meaning as an educational organization. Platypus does not begin with the intention of recruiting you nor converting you, but we do want to teach you. We want you to understand yourself, and this requires understanding history and the truth of its falsity and the falsity of its truth. As Rosa Luxemburg wrote in 1915, socialism is the first popular movement in world history that has set itself the goal of bringing human consciousness and thereby free will into play in the social actions of mankind. For this reason, Friedrich Engels designated the final victory of the socialist proletariat a leap of humanity from the animal world into the realm of freedom. This leap is also an iron law of history, bound to the thousands of seeds of a prior torment-filled and all too slow development. But this can never be realized until the development of complex material conditions strikes the incendiary spark of conscious will in the great masses. The victory of socialism will not descend from heaven. It can only be won by a long chain of violent tests of strength between the old and the new powers. The international proletariat, under the leadership of the Social Democrats, will thereby learn to try to take its history into its own hands. Instead of remaining a will-less football, it will take the tiller of social life and become the pilot to the goal of its own history. If there is one thing Platypus can teach you, it's that learning from Marxism means learning from failure, which means first recognizing a failure as such. Thank you very much. All right, we can take some questions from the audience if anyone has anything they want to voice or object to, clarify, reflect on, statements, diatribes, platitudes, bromides. Yeah.
When you said, I forgot exactly when or what PowerPoint it was, but you said something like there hasn't been any major revolution since the 20th century or something to that effect, the left dying.
Mm-hmm.
Would that not just be a part of the dialectic between capitalism and socialism or communism? Going forward and changing power structures like dialectics do.
Can you say more about what you mean by the dialectic of, how did you put it, capitalism and revolution? Is that what you said?
Capitalism and socialism or communism.
Right, right. Can you say more about that?
I guess, I don't know a whole lot about dialectics. I need to learn more, obviously, but part of it is the quantitative increase before the qualitative.
Mm-hmm.
And recently, as what we've been seeing in the US, me personally, I don't know whether it's just my algorithm on social media or whatnot, but I've been seeing around me and on social media a lot more revolutionary sentiment, and I see that being captured a lot by what I would describe as fake leftists, as you do. But I feel like that's might be a qualitative push or quantitative before the qualitative.
What I would suggest is not to schematize it. So the way that dialectics has been taken up in the 20th century is in this very, like schematic kind of way, wherein these phrases get bandied about, like the idea of the quantitative turning into the qualitative. This is like somewhat of a Maoist or like Marxist-Leninist kind of Stalinist notion, right? That is authorized by some of the writings of Engels on dialectics of nature and all that sort of thing. I won't get too deep into the like esoteric dialectic stuff for anyone who's here unfamiliar, but just like broadly, I would say that this idea of understanding social reality is contradictory, right? Like I think we can all pick up on what I mean when I describe social reality as contradictory without having to know the deep Marxist theory behind it. Just that something feels wrong, something is off, and fundamentally there is an alienation that is extending from and within society and our participation in it, rather than external to it. So what I'm trying to say is that that society is at odds with itself. That's how things appear under capitalism. For Marx, this method of the dialectic, which is basically a way of treating the contradiction between bourgeois social relations of production and industrial forces of production, that which preceded the era of the Industrial Revolution, and then what is intimate to the processes of capital's expansion later on. This method is trying to maintain fidelity to the way that society is coming apart, and it is trying to recognize how it's trying to recognize the imminent potential that lies within this crisis, and that it entails a pathway beyond itself. Now, to phrase it or to frame it in terms of there being like a dialectic of capitalism and revolution, the reason why I would offer that might be too schematic is that it leaves out the subjective factor of history. It leaves out the way in which we're all bound up in capitalism and that we are all spontaneously reproducing it in our thought. And this is why it's inadequate to treat capitalism as like a fixed thing, or like what some people might refer to as like an economic mode of production, or a stage. Instead, it's something that we're all reproducing, both in our behavior, but also in the way we think and relate to each other. And I don't mean to imply that this is like somehow we're all brainwashed by capitalism or something like that. That would be kind of like an almost New Left Maoist, like kill the bourgeois in your head sort of thought figure. Instead, I would offer that the way that we're reproducing capitalism is as a crisis. So that's kind of why I personally find it helpful to think of the individual subjective way we feel under capitalism as being that something is off or wrong. I'm probably at risk of oversimplifying it in doing so, but hopefully that's like a stimulating kind of starting point, right? The idea being just that revolution isn't automatic. It isn't going to just happen, at least not in the sense of what we might call like a proletarian revolution, not like, workers seizing the means of production or whatever. Perhaps a provocative way to put it is actually the opposite, which is that revolution is happening all the time, in fact. It's happening all the time under capitalism. And the task of a working class movement for socialism is to direct those revolutionary forces in service of ending this revolutionary process once and for all, right? That's why I invoked that kind of slamming the emergency brake metaphor, which comes from Walter Benjamin. He refers to revolution as like a runaway train. He's like, well, what if in actual fact we need to stop the runaway train with one, he doesn't say this, but my reading of it is that, one last hurrah, one last revolution, and we'll be done with it, sort of thing. which, I'm not using that to describe how revolution will actually look, because it will be a protracted what's the word I'm looking for, like process. But nonetheless, it maybe helps to kind of clarify the stakes, maybe a little bit, yeah. Also, if I said anything that was too opaque or esoteric, this is you guys have a chance to kind of ask me what I meant, because I realized that when you've been in a project for a couple of years, you kind of end up trying to clarify what you mean to yourself. So that was part of the reason why I wanted to give this teaching. I wanted to finally summarize for myself what Platypus even was through my experience in the organization. But I realized that there might be aspects of it that completely went over your head, and that's fine, as it would have gone over my head 4 or 5 years ago before I joined Platypus. Or anything that anyone's dying to know about the left that wasn't necessarily addressed to in my teaching, but I can still bring out. What about you guys? What's your background on the left? Have you been in organizations before? Are you new to this whole thing? Yeah.
I wouldn't say that I'm hugely into politics. I've seen the
Good.
way
That's a good starting point.
I've seen the way that the world has kind of turned, especially in American politics at the moment. And I've always sort of aligned myself very, very far away from the really right-wing conservative shit. That's not me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I saw the poster and I was like, yeah, get some learning. And I think it's really important in anything that you do to get a variety of opinions and different thoughts about what's going on.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, when we were doing our tabling at the orientation week last week, what I was trying to communicate to everyone who came up to us who wasn't already a self-identified leftist was that it's fine if you're on the right or apolitical when you come to Platypus. We don't regard that as a problem. To a certain extent, if someone's a dyed-in-the-wall, old conservative, they're probably not coming to have their mind changed, but we haven't really experienced that. Mostly it's young people who, like yourself, haven't really made up your mind, and I think it's good to have an open mind. And like I said in the teaching, one thing that sets us apart is that we're not really here to actually convert you. We don't have any interest in trying to indoctrinate you. What we want to do, however, is we want to provoke an atmosphere of critical thought and independent thinking, because that is on a superficial level in the spirit of the left historically, but on a deeper level it tasks us with trying to understand our society generally. And for Platypus, the history of society is the history of the left. You can't extricate these two things, and I don't mean that in the same way as the history of what's a good example? The history of film is the history of society, or the history of it's not like some object that's on display at a museum exhibition, although it kind of is in another sense, which speaks to my point about the left being dead. That is what it has become, but we must recover it from being merely that, right? But the point I'm more directly trying to communicate is just that we are tasked with trying to recognize the story, or the history, the way we remember the past, as being authorized in some way by that past, including everything that people tend to forget or elide, which is why I kind of spoke briefly about, I can't remember if I put it in there, but about, vindicating, I think I referred to it as missed opportunities. That's kind of the history against the grain approach that Platypus tries to encourage people to consider. So, we want to be provocative, but not merely for its own sake. We don't really want to be in the business of thinking merely for the sake of thinking. We want to think for the sake of remembering what was lost, so that we can make good on it, on its unfulfilled potential. Let me use another way of looking at it, and that is that it can be helpful to think of this kind of like revolutionary history as obscure, not as like friendly or proximal to us. It can be instructive to try and regard the left as a dead language, as words on a page you don't understand. So when you pick up, I don't know, like Das Kapital or any of the like famous works of Marx or Lenin or whoever else, definitely you should start with, like you should be, you have self-selected to be in this room. No one here is like dumb. No one, no one can't, like, if they commit to it, try and understand it. But as a thought exercise, it might be useful to look at it and be like, why do I not understand this? And maybe that has less to do with me and more the ideas I've inherited. Like maybe this stuff once upon a time was not difficult but easy. Maybe if you were in the time of revolutionary Marxism, these ideas would be a lot more accessible. Maybe not accessible to the general public, but like to those that were in the know, they knew all the main terms and they could like just whiz through some of these texts. That's another way that the present absence of Marxism should kind of like, like glower at us from across history, rather than being up close and us pretending like Marx is this friendly kind of bearded uncle figure that we can just like bring around for parties to tell us stories about the revolution, right? Maybe in actual fact, Marx is haunting us, and we should sustain that and try and take history seriously, because it was serious. Millions of people have lost their lives in the name of this thing called Marxism, and it would be a little brash to try and just tack their cause onto whatever the latest thing we're reacting against is, right? I don't know if that resonates with you guys, or maybe like chimes with other stuff you've been thinking about. But generally, like when we do our weekly reading group, we try and like facilitate a kind of open conversation where people might bring in like, Trump is doing this crazy thing, I'm freaking out, and then we'll be like, oh, why are you freaking out? What's the big deal? And then people will be like, what do you mean, what's the big deal? And it's like, well, we need to like think about this soberly. We need to not lose our minds about it, because the way we react in times of crisis actually shed a great deal of light on the moment that we're living in, as well as the conceptual frameworks that we've inherited from the past, or as Platypus would argue, from the defeats of the past. And when we do our coffee breaks on campus, it's a bit more like unstructured, where we're kind of able to redirect those kind of more free-cut conversations that are kind of distracting us from reading, like the text or whatever. So just for context, we do like a weekly reading group that repeats yearly. So it's like we read the main, I don't want to call it like the canon, but to a certain extent it has been canonized by the left. The works of Marx and Engels and various other like radical thinkers, both of the Enlightenment, but also following Marx and Engels and Lenin's time in the 20th century, which includes kind of the Frankfurt School and other kind of miscellaneous intellectuals associated with that project, which has become known as critical theory. Did my teaching like clarify what Platypus is? That would be the main question. Or does it still appear like this? Well, okay. What do you guys think Platypus is? Now that and in as few words as possible, what does it sound like it is?
Quiz time.
What's that?
I say quiz time.
Quiz time.
Yeah.
Pop quiz, hot shot.
Probably just like a learning group, right?
Yeah, probably a learning group. Probably a learning group, because that's what a lot of the left has become. Yeah. But also like a learning group that wants to like change the world. I know that sounds, very like grandiose or something, but that is the aim of the left, and that is why people gravitate towards the left, is because they aren't satisfied with the status quo and they want to see something change. Now, I'm not saying that's like necessarily the best reason to come to the left, because people go to the right for the exact same reason. And this ties in with my point earlier about how capitalism transforms itself and revolutionizes itself. But nonetheless, like in broad terms, like people will come to a reading group like Marx because they want to understand. They want to understand how they might be part of this process of transforming the world. And yet it isn't enough. And I think that's the point I'm trying to draw out in this teaching, is that like it isn't enough to just say like I'm going to come to a reading group to understand better how I might change reality, because that then implies that you can just go out and change reality. Nor is it sufficient to say I want to fuck theory, I just want to go out and change the world, like theory is for nerds, and it's a waste of time. It's just people talking to each other. It's a circle jerk.
Kind of true.
It is kind of true, right? No, that's like a good point. It is kind of true, and so people have a plausible basis in entertaining this notion. Yeah, can you say more about that? Like what are you thinking of? What are you imagining when you say that's kind of true?
I see a bunch of people standing in a university lecture room.
No, that's a good answer. That is honestly like your gut instinct is the best answer, because what you're doing is you're plucking out of the ether like what common sense has like bestowed upon us, or like what ideas we've inherited, right? And what we've inherited from, if not our experiences, the experiences of those who have taught us what the left is and what it's capable of. And we have this a priori assumption that like, it kind of speaks to my point from earlier, right? That intellectuals just are cozied up in like the ivory tower NGOs or all that sort of thing. Like the furthest thing from our imagination is the life of like a paid professional revolutionary like Rosa Luxemburg or Lenin or someone else who lives their life in exile. They're like paid by a party to write and to produce articles for their newspaper, and that the working class gets their knowledge of social reality, of current events, from the socialist movement. That papers are circulated within like factories, within unions, within the kind of, I mentioned briefly that parties like the Social Democratic Party in Germany had like night schools and temperance leagues and bands and soccer clubs and all sorts of things where these ideas would be disseminated, and a person could acquire an intellectual education even if they didn't seek out that vocation for themselves. So the consciousness of what it means to be part of a movement and part of a class was distributed and disseminated via the activities of that class within the context of working towards socialism. So the fact that that is obscure to us today, like this very like palpable and enormous phenomenon of life in the turn of the 20th century, the pre-World War I years that I described, says a lot, I think, if we're trying to register this present absence, right? You look like you want to say something.
Not really, no.
Not really? Taking it all in?
Yeah.
Well, sometimes just listening in can be the most productive exercise, because these ideas might stick with you a while, I know that when I first started coming to Platypus, it was during lockdown, and I had just returned to uni. I was like a mature student, so I was in my late 20s. So I'm actually older than the average kind of new member of Platypus. Most people who come to Platypus are actually undergrads around the world, I mean. So we've got chapters in many cities in North America, because that's where it started, but also in Europe. And we have some kind of establishing chapters being set up in like Ireland and Chile and France and places like that. Australia would be the most recent kind of country that has acquired Platypus in a big way, and I was a part of trying to set up that chapter just at a distance, because I was living in Australia and then I moved to New Zealand. I kind of had to, I lost my job, relocated back to New Zealand, but via Zoom I was kind of keeping in touch with friends from Melbourne who were part of Platypus and trying to help set that up. And then I was like, fuck it, I'm just going to start a chapter in New Zealand, which I did in 2021. Didn't really have any success while I was down in Dunedin at the University of Otago, because I guess, just law students want to get drunk or something. But here at Auckland, it's been great, and a lot more people have been interested, which is really good. There is, I don't know, maybe there's more of a culture here, I don't know, but yeah. What of our our members and contacts in the room? Does this stimulate anything, Jamie?
It's good. It's good. Really good. Yeah, nice and structured. I thought, sorry, what did you say was Hudson?
So-
Your name? Yeah,
Yes.
like I think there was kind of something to your question, right? Like there's some content then you kind of like glanced off it that there is like this sort of the dialectic revolution within capitalism, right? Like there's not nothing. It's just that there's maybe the sort of aggregation of like agitation or whatever doesn't just like linearly produce that thing. But I thought there was something that was really like there's
That's
like
a much more succinct and better way to put it than I did.
well, no,
Thank
but
you.
I think, but what I was saying is that there's something that's that you've kind of apprehended there, which is cool.
Thank you.
But yeah, I don't know.
Does this challenge you guys' understanding of Marxism or capitalism? Did you have preconceptions before you came into the room that you feel like you're going to go away with and think about some more?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What's the source of apply the Marxism to different countries? It's just like maybe some countries are developed countries, some countries are developing countries.
Mhm.
Is the Marxism, if applied to these countries, is the original Marxism, or should to do some changes for this?
Sure.
Marxism?
Yeah.
And how changes?
Yeah, this is a good question, and I think this speaks to the history of Marxism in a really interesting way, because what we're bringing out here is the history of contentions on the Marxist left that really came to the fore in the 20th century, but we're actually older than that, had their roots in what's known as the high period of imperialism in the late 19th century. Marxists, even at that time, were already talking about these notions of like what does it mean to develop socialism in Russia, which was regarded as a backwards country because it was less industrialized than the main kind of industrial countries of Europe. And in the context of these debates and discussions, people like Lenin were trying to clarify how socialism might realize the potential of like a global of the global cooperation of capitalism without necessarily being bounded to these delimited national state forms. Now, traditionally, this kind of like there's a reproach on the left, right, against this view that's opposed to like quote unquote national self-determination or like socialism in one country. People will call that Trotskyist or something. It's actually older than Trotsky. It's actually like it goes back to the revisionist dispute in the time of the Second International, which itself is a product of imperialism. Imperialism here defined as simply the tendency of the state to have an influence in managing the crisis of society, which it does through ensuring that capital can expand in other countries, right? Now, where I'm going with this is that imperialism is a global phenomenon, and so can capitalism. We did actually just read Trotsky from 1906, Results and Prospects, which is about his response to the 1905 Russian Revolution, where Trotsky makes this claim that the development of capitalism in one country does not necessarily mean that socialism can be limited to that one country, that the genie is out of the bottle, so to speak, within the context of capitalism development, because it implies global trade routes and it implies a global economy and the expansion of the accumulation of capital. However, at this time that he's writing, Trotsky is not yet like what we might consider like Trotskyist or anything. He's not like he's not separated from the core of the Second International. He's actually stating what is a very like orthodox point of view. However, what happens later in the 20th century is you get the crisis of World War I, which splits people within this controversy down the lines of like national chauvinist or like defending the fatherland, that sort of view that like, okay, we have to make sure that if our country that we are currently, like, for instance, in Germany, right, they've got representatives in the Reichstag, members of the Socialist Democratic Party, the SPD do, and so they're like, we have to like preserve our gains and make sure that we're not going to somehow endanger the gains of the working class by opposing the war, right? So they are divided from those who are like, well, no, this is all part of the crisis of capitalism and also, by extension, Marxism. And our task is to clarify what is actually going on and how that is reproducing itself in the movement. This turns into the later crises in Russia after the failure of the Russian Revolution. Now, of course, like a traditional like leftist historiography would hold that the Russian Revolution succeeded, and of course, you know, they overthrew the provisional government and all the rest. However, that revolution depended upon the German Revolution. Germany was like the powerhouse of European industry, and as such, the Russian movement at the time depended on the SPD to win the 1918 to 1919 revolution that came after World War I. However, they didn't. Some of the leftmost leaders of that movement, or the most radical of that movement, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, were assassinated, and ultimately the workers were put down. Even as the Social Democratic government prevailed, it did so in the name of like preserving the revolution, but ultimately it was counter-revolutionary, which is the reflection of what happened in Russia with Stalinism. And after that point, there are all sorts of controversies, after Lenin dies that is, all sorts of controversies about what it means to preserve the gains of the revolution in an isolated kind of way, so in a defensive kind of position, right? That's actually how we had a Chinese international student who came to our reading group last year, this young guy called Frank, who was very, I found very helpful in understanding China, and because I don't know a lot about it, I always appreciate talking to people about it. But his justification of the Chinese Communist Party today is that it is defending China even as it needs to sometimes necessarily be anti-democratic or adopt an anti-democratic position, because if it doesn't, there is the risk that foreign imperialist powers will kind of infect China with capitalism. Whereas nominally, China refers to itself as still being in the kind of the dictatorship of the proletariat phase. When that will end, we do not know. But that would be my preliminary response, that these discussions about nations are not new but old, and they extend from the crisis of Marxism itself. So when I refer to Marxism as being in crisis, I mean it in the same sense that capitalism is in crisis. It is continually reproducing itself whenever it encounters a fundamental instability, you might say. And Marxism needs to necessarily, people talk about this phenomenon of like splitting and rebranding and regrouping on the left. You know, left groups will like rename themselves. Like you can see it at the moment with the Trump presidency, and for the last like 8 to 10 years, the left has just been in this reactive position where some people will go in one direction, others will go in another. That's why I use this metaphor of organizing and militancy. I actually cribbed those from this guy, I think it's Mark Rudd. I can't remember if it's him or Bill Ayers, another one of the weathermen. I think it's Mark Rudd from an early issue of the Platypus Review, where I remember Spencer Leonard interviewed him. And that was his self-understanding. So he was a new leftist. He was a boomer who was around during 1968, right? So people can recall the recent protests around the world by students surrounding Israel, Palestine, and Gaza that started on Columbia, the campus of the University in New York. And the same thing happened in 1968. The Students for a Democratic Society were responsible for, who were like the largest new left group at the time, were responsible for taking over and occupying a number of buildings on campus there. And one of the figures associated with that was Mark Rudd. And he explains in his interview that of his generation, who were kind of the younger part of the new left, were frustrated at this kind of like civil social or social democratic and the kind of more modern kind of Democratic Party aligned sense. They were frustrated with the idea of building the movement and just organising people and going to the people, which had a much more like union-oriented kind of approach than we kind of have today on the left. Although there is still a lot of that talk, but it was much bigger then. Now, the young ones were kind of annoyed at these or frustrated with these older leftists who they called red diaper babies, which just means like someone who's born into a communist family and take a lot of communist notions for granted. They instead, this younger cohort, wanted to be more militant. And so with the crisis of the Democratic Party that happened under the 1968 election, when a bunch of young students kind of just turned their backs on the Democratic Party for putting forward candidates they viewed as insufficiently anti-war, by their own account of history, they produced the conditions for Nixon to be elected, and then Nixon got re-elected in 1972 against George McGovern. And so this produced a split within the movement wherein a number of young new leftists wanted to be more militant, so they started turning inwards. Some who are more aligned with Trotskyism started doing this thing where they kind of retreated into the factories and just wanted to organize workers there. Others started urban guerrilla terror cells, and that's what the Weathermen became, that group I mentioned in my teaching. They renamed themselves to the Weather Underground and began blowing up public monuments and blowing up police stations. I think they blew up did they blow up a bathroom of the Pentagon? I can't remember the entire history. But yeah, this was this is another aspect of the past that has been kind of brushed over. Maybe not as a positive lesson, or I don't know how you guys feel about it, but it was very common for bombings. People were almost as numb to it as people are today to school shootings in America. It was shocking at first, then by the early 1980s it was not even front page news anymore. It's some new crazy leftist group has blown up some statue somewhere. Yeah. Hudson?
I'm so sorry, I have to go.
That's all right. No worries.
Thank you so much. It was a great talk.
Yeah, all good. You're always welcome. Come along to the reading group sometime.
We
Yes.
actually need to leave as well.
Yeah, cool. Well, I'll wrap it up. But thank you all for coming, and I hope you guys stick around for Platypus events. You're always welcome, or drop us a line on Instagram, the one that Jamie mentioned, Platypus New Zealand. Cool. Thanks very much.
Thank you. One minute in the punctuation.